Hello everyone, I'm Message II. Welcome back to my channel. Today let's discuss a non-technical topic, a bit of gossip you could say. We're going to talk about two blunders made by the NSW Department of Education. The first is a recent hot topic, an incident involving chaotic scenes that occurred on the 2nd of May 2025, the day of the OC Opportunity Class, and selective high school placement tests at three main exam centres in the Sydney Central region. I believe many of you are already aware of this. The other is an exclusive report from this channel. Absolutely first-hand, absolutely detailed, and an absolutely unheard of blunder. For both incidents, I will try to start from the factual level to give everyone an objective picture. Building on that, I will also offer some of my personal opinions. Finally, I will share the insights I've gained from these two events, including answering questions like, why do we put in so much effort to get into selective schools? With the overall structure introduced, let's move on to the first part of the main text, the exam centre chaos incident. Before discussing the incident itself, there's an important background detail to introduce: the change in the format of the NSW's Selective High School Placement Test in 2025. In 2024 and earlier, the selective school exam was conducted in the traditional paper and pen format. Invigilators would distribute paper test booklets to candidates who would then fill in their answers on paper, answer sheets, and submit them. Moreover, exam centres were distributed throughout the state, and candidates were usually assigned to a location not far from their school district, with each exam centre not having an overwhelming number of candidates. In 2025, the selective school exam was changed to an online format, requiring candidates to use computers at the exam centre to log into the testing system and complete the exam. Alongside this reform was a change in the distribution of exam centres in the Sydney Central region, consolidating many previously dispersed centres into three large, centralised ones. However, even these three large exam centres could not accommodate all candidates simultaneously, so the exam had to be conducted over 3 days, the 2nd, 3rd and 4th of May. Against this backdrop, on the 2nd of May, the first day of the OC and selective high school exams, at the three large exam centres in the Sydney Central region, the OC exam, originally scheduled for the morning and due to finish at 11 a.m, was delayed by about an hour due to traffic congestion caused by a large number of candidates rushing to the centres, as well as technical glitches in the computer-based testing system. The selective high school exam, originally scheduled to start at 12 p.m, was, in some exam rooms within these centres, ultimately cancelled at 1:30 p.m. after a 90-minute delay because the widespread chaos from the morning's OC exam hadn't subsided and the rooms couldn't be reset. However, some other exam rooms did start the exam and were not halted due to the chaos at the location. Candidates in these exam rooms completed their papers despite being at a chaotic exam centre. After the incident, the Department of Education cancelled the subsequent exams on the 3rd and 4th of May at the three large exam centres, issued an apology, and arranged for a resit for those candidates who couldn't take the exam. But for the candidates who completed the exam at the chaotic exam centres on the 2nd of May, the department also gave them a second chance to take the exam, and their ranking and admission would be based on the better of their two scores. If the chaos at the exam centres and the rescheduling of exams caused dissatisfaction among candidates, after all, weekend playdates had to be changed to more revision, then this opportunity for a second exam, with the higher score counting, thoroughly enraged the parents, because this touched upon the core of a selective test: fairness. Who felt it was unfair? Candidates from the three major exam centres whose exams were cancelled felt it was unfair. They would say, why does someone get two chances? If you take a makeup exam, you should use the score from that makeup exam. Why take the better of two? We learnt this in math, right? If the probability of success in one exam is p, then the probability of succeeding at least once in 2 attempts is 2p minus p squared, which is clearly greater than p. If a student normally has a 30% chance of success, taking the exam twice and using the better score gives them a 51% chance of success. Candidates from smaller exam centres who were completely unaffected also felt it was unfair. Why does someone get an extra 2 weeks of revision time? Not to mention the possibility of today's exam questions being leaked, allowing them to get the exact same questions next time. Even just an extra 2 weeks is enough to make further progress. Those who completed the exam on the 2nd of May were likely not celebrating at home either. They would indeed get a second chance and more preparation time, but the torment and psychological pressure they endured might have been even greater than for those whose exams were cancelled. After all, they also had to bear the accusations of others about the 2p minus p squared advantage. Perhaps, in a situation where the planned process completely breaks down, no one truly benefits. I want to remind everyone here that the impact of taking the better of two scores might not be as significant as you imagine. We get 2p minus p squared based on a key assumption that these two random events are independent and identically distributed. In reality, this assumption is very likely false. They are neither independent nor identically distributed. Why? It can almost certainly be said that the candidates who completed the exam on the 2nd of May were not in their best state. Almost all of them had stood in a chaotic crowd for over 2 hours before entering the exam room. This is a huge test of stamina and emotional state. Moreover, it's highly probable that while they were answering questions in the classroom, they could still hear the noise from outside. How focused they could be on answering the questions. I'd put a big question mark on that. I don't know how many people felt they were unaffected or only slightly affected, but for those who were affected and chose to resit, I believe there's a high probability they would perform better than on the 2nd of May. In this scenario, how much difference is there really between taking the better score and taking the score of a makeup exam? Having discussed the recent highly publicized exam center chaos, let me tell you about a lost exam paper incident from a year ago that received no attention at all, but is very interesting. How little attention did it receive? Pretty much only the parties involved knew about it. In May 2024, the Selective high school exam was held as scheduled. I sent my son into the exam room and breathed a sigh of relief. As I mentioned in the first episode of this video series, the journey begins. A few hours later, the exam ended. Everything went smoothly. My son came out in good spirits, telling me he felt he could get full marks in maths and that he did very well in writing and thinking skills. My habit is, for exams, once they're over, they're over. There's no point dwelling on which questions were right or wrong. But I was curious about the writing topic, a bit like how netizens dig up the essay topics from China's college entrance exam each year. My son told me the writing topic and how he approached it. Everything sounded normal. Until the 5th of August, shortly before the results were released, I received an email from the NSW Department of Education. The email was short, and to summarize, it conveyed 4 things. First, it informed me of a fact. On my child's academic report, the writing component shows no score. Mark this. It was only at the stage of calculating the total score and generating the report that they discovered the missing writing score. From the May exam until the marking concluded in August, no one had noticed this student was missing a writing paper. Second, it proposed 4 possible reasons. I have to say, these 4 reasons, in my opinion, seemed more like speculations from an outsider's perspective. What reasons did they propose? Speculation 1, the candidate did not complete this section of the exam. Speculation 2, the candidate was late or left early. Speculation 3, the candidate did not participate in or complete the writing exam due to injury. Let's talk about these first 3. They might sound like a lot, numbered 1, 2, 3, but if you look closely, is there any essential difference? No. Being late, leaving early, or being injured are all just reasons. Don't they all conclude that the candidate didn't take the exam? Of course, I can say that I sent my child into the exam room and I picked him up, so he should have been in there. But don't you think it's the invigilator's responsibility to record how many people were supposed to be there, how many actually attended, and who was absent? Absences should be recorded, and arriving too late or submitting too early should also be recorded from an anti-cheating perspective. Besides, even if late or leaving early, you still have to submit the paper. Injury is even stranger. If they were completely absent due to injury, you should have recorded an absence. If they were injured midway, that should definitely be recorded, as it involves issues of liability. This reminds me of this year's exam center chaos. I saw in the media that every time the system malfunctioned, invigilators had to fill out records, leading some to complain that recording took up too much time. But I believe this practice is absolutely necessary. Although it takes time, only by doing so can an audit trail be left, allowing the examining authority to know which candidates were affected and to implement appropriate remedies or actions. So, I'd like to ask, was there a similar recording procedure in the 2024 writing exam room? If not, this would be a serious loophole. If a candidate isn't good at a subject, they could just skip it, right? The department would just assume they lost the paper themselves and even apologize to you. If there was, then as the person in charge, you wouldn't need to speculate whether we were injured, late, left early, or didn't show up. Couldn't you just check the records to find out? Faced with such a paradox, I can only say I didn't see any effort from the Department of Education to identify the root cause of the problem. Finally, speculation 4, the test paper was lost during transportation from the exam center to the marking center. Okay, this is the only reasonable speculation I can accept. Although I still believe that collected papers should be counted, then sealed for transport, and counted again upon unsealing. If we accept the lost paper speculation, my next question is, how many were lost? Was it just ours or an entire exam room's worth? I immediately asked parents from the same exam center. They hadn't received similar emails. Returning to the third point in the letter, it proposed a solution: to use the scores from the other three subjects to replace the missing writing score. In other words, to scale up the scores from the other three subjects, which constituted 85% of the total, to 100% to serve as the final grade. And it told me this was a statistically valid practice. Your method isn't wrong in terms of magnitude, but its correctness ends there. To use an
举个不恰当
inappropriate
的例子，
example, if
如果
Sheldon
Sheldon
Cooper's
Cooper
physics
他
paper was
的物理试
lost
卷丢
and you
了，你
extrapolated a
用
score
开
for him
车、
based
体
on his
育、
driving,
情商给他
sports,
外推
and
一个
emotional
分数出来，
intelligence,
他会怎
what
么
would
说
he
呢？
say?
Oh, of course. You can totally infer that my physics is also terrible based on the fact I can't play basketball, can't drive, and don't understand subtext. After all, the Nobel Prize Committee for Physics also bases its scores on who can jump the highest. Bazinga.
Ending the third point of the letter with such an unfunny and un-Sheldon-like imitation, we come to the final point, simply an apology. No problem with that. As a parent, how would you feel upon receiving such a letter? My internal monologue isn't the focus of this video, so I'll omit 10,000 words here. Below is how I replied. This letter I wrote was quite long, but its central idea covered 4 points. First, the blame lies squarely with you, unless you say we didn't take the exam, in which case you need to prove it. Second, I raised my questions. Was it only our paper that was lost, or a batch or an entire exam room's? They didn't answer this directly in subsequent emails, but it sounded like it was just ours. Third, I refused the extrapolation based on 3 subjects. Honestly, if our writing skills usually dragged us down, I might have been happy to accept such a solution. However, as I mentioned in my previous video, after a year of effort in Year 5, our writing had improved tremendously, transforming from a subject my child feared into one he was very confident in. I admit, most bystanders might take my earlier Sheldon Cooper joke as just a joke. While they might see the logical absurdity, they would probably still advise me to just accept the extrapolation, but I still proposed my suggested solution in my 4th point. Firstly, at that point I couldn't determine if the lost paper was an isolated case or a wider issue, so I proposed that if more than just us were affected, organizing a resit for those few individuals would be more reasonable. Secondly, one way to solve the Sheldon Cooper dilemma is to calculate quantiles. Specifically, the approach is to determine the candidate's prospective rank in the official exam based on their rankings in relatively formal mock exams, which then serves as the basis for determining the score. It's like when you play League of Legends. Imagine you play many ranked games as, say, Garen. If the game's statistics show that your performance with Garen means you surpass 90% of other Garen players in your rank, that gives us a reliable quantile. So, if I can't directly evaluate your overall skill with Garen, I can approximate that you're on par with the Garen player who ranks 10th out of 100 similar Garen players. If I see their consistent performance contributes to maintaining their rank, I can estimate your contribution is similar. That's the quantile method. The advantage of this is that it acknowledges the independence between subjects. The disadvantage is also obvious. There are 2 different sample spaces, and the bias between them cannot be eliminated. That is, our tutoring center and the actual total candidate pool are 2 different sample spaces, and the differences between them cannot be quantified. If the tutoring center is stronger than the overall pool, the quantile estimation will underestimate our score. Conversely, if the tutoring center is weaker, it will overestimate our score. Of course, this method has another drawback. It's slightly more complicated and requires better communication with staff. Alright, those 4 points were the main content of my reply, sent on the night of the 5th of August. I received the department's response at 6 p.m. the next day. The reply was still quite brief, and again covered 4 things. First, the department leader stated they were satisfied that our contractors minutely examined all the test materials returned from your child's test center. How should I put this? In my view, there was no new information, a bit like when I ask my child to find a piece of clothing, and after searching for a long time, they come back saying, "It's not there, I've searched my entire wardrobe." But your clothes aren't necessarily in your wardrobe. Second, it repeated the extrapolation algorithm. Nothing much to say there. Third, this third point was very interesting. It said two things. The first sentence was, as you can also see, the writing test has the smallest weighting and is therefore unlikely to have an undue effect on the outcome either way. So, I'd like to ask, did you calculate it both ways, compare them, and then reach this conclusion? Or do you believe your subjective judgment can gain my approval? The second sentence was, in fact, your child has done far better in both mathematical reasoning and thinking skills than in reading, so an extrapolation for his writing test is more likely to advantage him. Parents, please call your child over to do a thinking skills question, which I'll display on the screen. Please tell me your answers in the comments section. If you have any thoughts after reading these two sentences from the department's reply, feel free to share them in the comments. The letter concluded, I regret the strategy you suggest is not available to us, nor would it be considered valid, and so my rejection was rejected. All right, this incident pretty much ended here. I didn't appeal further. There were two reasons for not appealing. One, the results released were acceptable. We had an offer from our third preference, Reserve C for our second preference, and Reserve F for our first preference. Considering the second preference is a very good school, the probability of getting in from Reserve C felt quite high, and I wasn't particularly attached to the first preference, so further appeal had a low cost-benefit ratio. Two, based on my speculation, the lost paper was an isolated case with no broader impact. I didn't believe the Department of Education would invest resources in handling such an individual case. So that's all about the lost exam paper incident. As an involved party, my criticisms are inevitably subjective. Due to my lack of understanding of the department's operations, my analysis and judgment are certainly limited. So, if I've said anything incorrect, please ignore it, forgive me, and feel free to point it out in the comments. If there's any merit in what I've said, I hope it can help the Selective Education Unit improve exam management, reduce the occurrence of similar situations, or, when they do occur, communicate more promptly and effectively with parents. After talking so much, finally, I'll share some insights I've gained from these two incidents. Firstly, if I were to say that selective schools in Near Souths are an absolutely niche pursuit, would you understand? Based on enrollment proportions, among all secondary students, 39% are in private schools, 56% are in comprehensive public schools, and students in selective schools account for only 5%. For such a niche pursuit, if you were the Department of Education, how many resources would you allocate to selective schools? Perhaps for those from countries like China or India, the idea that exams change destinies is deeply ingrained, leading to the belief that the label of a selective school directly implies more resources. I haven't done the research, but my intuition is that resource bias towards selective schools doesn't exist. This stems from Australia's fundamental values of fairness and equal opportunity. Elitism clearly conflicts with this value and is unlikely to be accepted by the majority. This is why, in the first episode of this series, I gossiped a bit about how the term selective high school is translated into Chinese as 精英中学, which literally means elite high school. You can take this name as a convention or as a good wish, but not as an indication of government resources. Hearing this, some might ask, if resources aren't more, facilities aren't better, and teachers aren't significantly different, then why am I putting in so much effort to get here? Let's look at it from three aspects. The first aspect is resources. Although selective high schools don't have significantly more funding, hardware, or staffing than the public school next door, the same teachers in a selective school can assume students have a solid foundation, eliminating the need to slow down the pace to cater to different starting points. Curriculum design can also be more academic, challenging students' upper limits more without fear of the teaching being too difficult. In other words, the total amount of resources is the same, but in a selective school, the same resources are less likely to be wasted and can be utilized more effectively to realize their value. The second aspect is culture. Compared to tangible resources, culture is perhaps the greatest intangible asset of a selective school. In some schools, being smart but not hardworking is seen as cool, while top students become isolated. In a selective school, the chubby kid next to you who grinds Brawl Stars with you will also sprint through the assessment block with you. Your efforts will be recognized and encouraged, and you'll find you're not the only one working hard. The third aspect Less important compared to the first two is that students in selective schools tend to benefit more from so-called scaling in the HSC scoring system. If an entire school is taking high difficulty subjects and achieving high scores, individual students' ATARs are also more likely to be boosted. We can make a video about scaling in the future. Finally, to all current and prospective selective school parents, I often see you criticizing the NSW Department of Education online. So do you consider the department an enemy or a friend? I think many parents can agree that carving out a separate path for academically focused students from among comprehensive public and private schools, thereby utilizing educational resources more effectively, is definitely a good thing. Are there areas where they fall short? Absolutely. You can't expect all your teammates to be god-tier players who can carry the whole lane by themselves, can you? This teammate, though temporarily 0 to 3, is still diligently defending the tower, participating in team fights, and even when they die, they send a "my bad." While you can't rely on them to win 1v5, at least they're not AFK, not intentionally feeding. They're trying to help you win in their own clumsy way. Alright, that's all for today. Thank you for watching until the end. I'm Boo Farger 2, and I'll see you next time.